I was told I was old enough to handle life on my own. It sounded like trust, like respect. But what it really meant was this: don't expect protection anymore. I didn't leave in anger. I left because there was no space left to stay. And for years, silence followed me like proof that I didn't matter. Then one night, long after I stopped asking to be chosen, my phone filled with messages I never expected to hear. Not advice, not guidance, requests. If you've ever been called independent right before being abandoned, stay with me. And if this story resonates, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. It really helps more people find stories like this. They didn't yell when it happened. There was no dramatic fight, no slammed door, just a sentence delivered calmly, like a fact that had already been decided. You're old enough to handle things on your own. It sounded reasonable, almost kind, like they were giving me credit. What they didn't say was what came with it. No backup, no safety net, no one checking if I made it home. That was the moment I became independent. Not because I was ready, but because they stepped away. I didn't leave with anger in my chest. I left with a checklist, bills to figure out, places to sleep, a budget that never balanced. The fridge in my first place stayed half empty, not because I forgot to shop, because I learned early that food had to last. I stopped calling when I was sick, stopped mentioning when I was scared. There was no point explaining problems to people who had already decided I could handle it. That's the part people miss. There was no abuse anyone could point to. No bruises, no broken bones. Just the quiet removal of protection. I learned how to sound confident on the phone, how to nod even when I didn't understand, how to say I'm fine before anyone asked the second question. From the outside, it looked like strength. Inside, it felt like constant alertness. There's a word for that. I learned later. When adults shift responsibility before a child is actually safe, psychologists call it a withdrawal of the protective role. It happens a lot in families that value image, where being seen as raising capable kids matters more than noticing when those kids are drowning quietly. Calling it independence makes it easier to live with. It sounds better than abandonment, more respectable than walking away. The truth is, independence without protection isn't empowerment, it's exposure. I didn't stop needing guidance when they said I was grown. I just stopped asking for it. Every decision felt heavier because there was no margin for error. If I failed, there was no one to soften the fall. People praised me for being mature, for not complaining, for figuring things out on my own. They didn't see the cost. I slept light. I overprepared. I apologized too much. Being forced to grow up early doesn't make you wise. It makes you vigilant. There were nights I stared at my notebook, writing things down not because I wanted to remember them, but because I was afraid I'd be told later that they never happened. Dates, conversations, promises that disappeared. Evidence felt safer than memory. I noticed something else. 2. The same people who said I was strong rarely asked if I was okay. Strength, I learned, is convenient for other people. It excuses their absence. When a child adapts, adults rarely question themselves. They point at the adaptation and call it proof that everything turned out fine. But adapting is not the same as healing. Surviving is not the same as being supported. I carried that confusion for years, wondering if I was ungrateful for feeling abandoned, wondering if needing help meant I had failed the test they never told me I was taking. If you've ever been told you were mature for your age, you might recognize this. How it sounds like praise but lands like a dismissal. I didn't become independent because I wanted freedom. I became independent because dependence wasn't allowed. There's a difference. One builds confidence, the other builds armor, and armor gets heavy when you never get to take it off. Looking back, I can see the pattern clearly. The moment responsibility moved onto my shoulders, accountability disappeared from theirs. That's the part no one talks about. When adults step back too early, they don't just give up control, they give up obligation. And the child learns a dangerous lesson, that needing help is weakness. That silence is safer than honesty. That being alone is the price of being capable. I didn't earn my independence. I absorbed it. And like most things you absorb under pressure, it left marks you don't see right away. People still tell me I'm strong. I don't correct them. But now I know the truth. Growing up too fast isn't a medal. It's often a symptom. A sign that someone who was supposed to stand guard decided it was easier to step aside. And once that happens, you don't grow up feeling proud. You grow up feeling watchful, always ready, always bracing. Because the moment you were called independent was the same moment you learned that protection could be taken away without warning. The first time I realized I wasn't just on my own was when other people started talking about me like I wasn't in the room. It didn't happen online at first. It happened at the grocery store. I was reaching for the cheapest carton of eggs when I heard my name behind me. Not spoken to me. Spoken about me. A woman I recognized from church leaned toward another one and said, "It's so sad. Poor Richard and Marianne. They tried everything." I froze with the eggs in my hand. I hadn't talked to those women in years. They didn't ask if I was okay. They didn't ask what happened. They already had the story. In a town like ours, news doesn't travel fast. It travels accurate to the person who speaks first. My parents had been here longer than I'd been alive. They knew the council members. They sat in the front rows at fundraisers. They were the ones people trusted with keys, with donations, with the microphone. I was just the girl who disappeared. So when people asked where I went, the answer didn't come from me. It came from the people with the cleanest reputation. At first, the rumors were almost gentle. She needed space. She's going through a phase. She's stubborn like her mother. Then they sharpened. I heard she ran off with bad influences. I heard she refused help. I heard they're heartbroken. The word that showed up the most was ungrateful. Ungrateful was convenient. It explained everything without anyone having to ask questions. I learned quickly that truth doesn't win in a small town. Volume does. A few weeks later, I went to a diner after a shift, still smelling like dish soap and fryer oil. I sat at the counter and tried to eat slowly, because I didn't know when I'd have another full meal. The man 2 stools away glanced at me, then looked away too quickly, like I had done something wrong just by existing. When the waitress refilled my water, she whispered, "Honey, I'm not judging you, but people are talking." I didn't ask who. I already knew. The next day, a letter showed up in my mailbox with no return address. Inside was a printed church bulletin. My parents' names were highlighted next to a family prayer request. There was a sentence written in neat handwriting at the bottom. Please pray for their daughter who has chosen a difficult path. Chosen. That word hit like a slap, because it made it sound like I had walked away from love. Not like love had been withheld until I complied. It was a clean rewrite. A version of events that made them look patient and me look unstable. And it worked. People didn't call to check on me. They called to correct me. One afternoon, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I answered anyway, because I was still naive enough to think adults meant well. A woman's voice came through, warm and practiced. "Elena, sweetheart, I'm calling because your parents are worried. They said you're struggling. They said you won't accept help." I stared at the wall of my tiny room. I pictured my empty fridge, my notebook with rent dates, my hands that shook from too much coffee and not enough sleep. And I realized something. They were building evidence. Not for the truth, for the narrative. If anyone ever asked what happened, they could point to concerned calls, prayer requests, friendly outreach. They could say, "We tried." Meanwhile, I was the one who looked unreasonable for not coming home. I didn't yell at that woman. I didn't argue. I just asked, "Did they tell you to ask me if I'm safe?" There was a pause. Then she said, softer now, "They said you're headstrong." Headstrong was the polite word for disobedient. I hung up. That night I walked past the community center and saw flyers for a fundraiser taped to the windows. My parents' names were listed as sponsors. I stood there under the buzzing light, reading it twice, and I felt the unfairness settle into my chest. They had a stage. They had a reputation. They had a room full of people ready to believe them. I had a job that barely covered rent and a story no one asked to hear. If you've ever been the one without the microphone, you know how that feels. Not just lonely, powerless. It didn't matter that I was telling the truth. It mattered that I was telling it alone. I tried, once, to correct someone. It was an older neighbor who had known me since I was a kid. She stopped me outside the laundromat and smiled like she was doing me a favor. "Your mother misses you," she said. "You know how she is? She worries." I swallowed and said, "She doesn't miss me. She misses the version of me she can present." The smile disappeared. Her eyes narrowed, not with concern, with judgment. "Oh, Elena," she said, like I was embarrassing her. "You shouldn't speak that way." That's when I understood the real rule in our town. You can suffer quietly. You can even leave. But you can't make people uncomfortable with the truth. I went back to my room and sat on the floor because I didn't have a couch yet. I opened my notebook and wrote down what had just happened. Not as a diary entry, as a record. Who said what time, where. Because when people with power tell your story for you, your memory starts getting questioned. Even by you. The pressure didn't always feel like an attack. Sometimes it came wrapped in concern. A text from an aunt I hadn't spoken to in years. "Your parents are getting older. Don't you think this is selfish?" A voicemail from a cousin. "Everyone says you're making them look bad." A message from someone I barely knew. "It's time to be the bigger person." Bigger person. What they meant was smaller voice. They weren't asking me to heal. They were asking me to restore the illusion. I'd walk through town and feel eyes on my back. Not angry eyes, curious ones. Like I was a story they wanted to finish without hearing my side. My parents didn't have to follow me. They didn't have to threaten me directly. The town did it for them. That's how community pressure works when it's pointed in one direction. It becomes a second set of hands. And the strangest part was, it almost worked. There were nights I stared at my phone and thought about calling. Not because I missed them, because I was tired. Because I wanted the noise to stop. That's when I caught myself. If you were me, would you go back for peace? Even if peace came at the price of your truth, I didn't have an answer yet. But I knew one thing. I was losing. Not because I was wrong, but because I wasn't the one speaking. And in a town that trusts reputation more than reality, the person without the microphone is always the easiest one to blame. So I stopped trying to win with words. I started looking for something harder to erase. I stopped trying to win with words. Because in my town, words were elastic. They stretched until they fit whoever had the better reputation. So I started looking for something that didn't bend. Something that could sit on a table and stay the same, no matter who stared at it. That's how the notebook became more than a notebook. I bought it at a discount store with my last $5. Plain cover, no lines on the outside, nothing that looked important, but I treated it like it was. Every time someone cornered me with a concerned question, I wrote it down. Every time a rumor changed shape, I wrote the date it changed. Every time my parents' story got cleaner, I wrote what had been left out. Not because I wanted revenge, because I was tired of being told my memory was the problem. When you're alone long enough, you start doubting your own timeline. You start wondering if you misheard, if you overreacted, if maybe you deserved it. That's what silence does. It makes the truth feel negotiable. I didn't want my life to be negotiable. Some nights I'd come home so exhausted my hands shook when I tried to unlock the door. I'd drop my keys in the same bowl. I'd open the fridge and see the same half-empty shelf, and then I'd open that notebook, not to relive it, to anchor it, because feelings fade, but facts are stubborn. I learned that the hard way the first time I tried to tell my side of the story out loud. It was a small conversation in a parking lot. A man I'd known since childhood said, "Your parents are good people. They'd never do what you're implying." I started explaining. I tried to keep my voice steady. He didn't argue with my details. He didn't ask questions. He just smiled and said, "Well, I'm sure they meant well." That was the moment I realized something. In certain families and certain towns, emotion is used like a trap. If you cry, you're unstable. If you get angry, you're disrespectful. If you speak calmly, you're cold. No matter how you feel, the conclusion is the same. You're the problem. So I stopped offering feelings. I started collecting evidence. It wasn't glamorous. Receipts, screenshots, voicemails saved instead of deleted, a photo of a letter before it disappeared. I even started filming my own hands sometimes while I worked. Not because I thought anyone would watch it, but because I needed proof that my life was real. If you've never had to prove your own reality, that might sound dramatic. But when people with power rewrite your story, your feelings aren't enough to stop them. Your feelings are what they use against you. I wasn't building a case for court. Not yet. I was building a case for consequence. There's a difference. A consequence isn't always legal. Sometimes it's social, sometimes it's personal, sometimes it's simply refusing to let someone erase what they did. I met Daniel Hayes around that time. He wasn't from our town. That mattered. He ran workshops at the community center, the one that used to be an old warehouse before someone decided it deserved a second life. I only went because there was a flyer offering free supplies, and I was tired of staring at bare walls. Daniel didn't talk like the people back home. He didn't soften everything. He didn't turn pain into a motivational poster. He looked at the small piece I made out of scrap metal and broken glass and said, "This is honest. No praise, no pity. Just that. Honest." I didn't tell him my story that day. I didn't have to. He could see it in the way I handled sharp edges without flinching. I started coming back every week. Not because I thought I was talented, but because the warehouse felt like the first place where the truth didn't have to compete. I brought Daniel my notebook once, not to show him every page, just to explain why I was always writing. He didn't laugh. He didn't call it obsession. He nodded like it made perfect sense. Then he said something I still remember. "People think talking creates change. It doesn't. Not when the power is uneven. Evidence creates change." I didn't fully understand what he meant until later. In families like mine, people will tell you to keep it private, to handle it inside the house, to be respectful. What they really mean is, don't make it undeniable. Because as long as it's just feelings, they can call it a misunderstanding. As long as it's just memories, they can call it drama. As long as it's just you saying it, they can call it defamation. But when you can point to something concrete, the conversation changes. It stops being, Why are you so upset? And becomes, what exactly happened? And that question terrifies the people who depend on vagueness. That's why I didn't fight them with speeches. I fought them with objects. Metal that couldn't be smoothed over, glass that caught light in uncomfortable ways, pieces that looked beautiful from far away and dangerous up close. It was the closest thing I had to a voice that didn't shake. And slowly, without me announcing it, the story began to shift. Not because people suddenly believed my pain, but because they started noticing patterns. A comment someone made in passing that matched what I had written months ago, a concerned question that sounded rehearsed. A gap in my parents' version that didn't add up. Evidence doesn't need everyone to agree. It only needs enough people to notice. That's the part I want you to take with you. We're taught that family conflicts are solved through feelings, through talks, through forgiveness. But when the power is uneven, feelings don't create accountability. They create noise. Facts create consequences. I wasn't documenting my life to punish them. I was documenting my life to protect myself. Because when you're the one without the microphone, you need something stronger than your voice. You need something that stays true even when people try to make you doubt it. So I kept writing. I kept saving. I kept building. And I didn't know it yet. But I was laying the foundation for the moment when their story would finally run out of room. The question was, how long would it take before the truth had nowhere left to hide? The first apology didn't come with tears. It came with a flyer. I saw it taped to the glass door of the community center, right where everyone had to walk past it. A big announcement for a charity event, names in bold, smiles in perfect lighting, and at the bottom, a small line that looked harmless. Thank you to our longtime supporters, Richard and Marianne Brooks. I stared at that line longer than I should have, because it told me something before anyone ever said it out loud. They still had the microphone. Even after everything, they still had the stage, the tables, the introductions, the warm handshakes, and for a while, it stayed that way. Then things started to change, not in one dramatic moment, not in a way anyone would call karma. It was quieter than that, more practical. A missed payment, a delayed deposit, a role they used to have suddenly going in a different direction. At first, I only heard it in passing. A woman behind me in line at the post office said, "Did you hear Richard step down from the council committee?" Another one replied, "They said it was his choice. People always said that when someone was being pushed out." Then my aunt sent me a message I hadn't asked for. "Your mom's been under a lot of stress. It's not easy to keep up with everything." Keep up. That word stood out. Because my mother had always been perfect at keeping up. Keeping up appearances, keeping up control, keeping up the version of our family that made other people feel safe. If she was slipping, it meant something was taking more than it was giving. A month later, I got a call from Liam. We weren't close friends at the time, more like two people who shared a hallway and an understanding. He'd watched the rumors swallow me, and he'd been quiet through most of it. Now his voice sounded careful. "They're not doing great," he said. I didn't ask. "Why right away?" I asked. "Who told you?" He hesitated. "Everyone." That was the first time I heard it said like that. Not gossip, not a story, a consensus. I didn't feel satisfied. I felt alert. Because I'd learned something about apologies in my town. They didn't arrive when someone realized they were wrong. They arrived when someone lost the ability to keep being right. And that difference matters. There's a kind of apology that comes from remorse. It starts with ownership. It doesn't negotiate. It doesn't ask you to restore their comfort. It sounds like, "I did this. I can't undo it. Tell me what you need, and I'll respect it even if it hurts me. And then there's a kind of apology that comes from desperation. It comes when consequences show up at the door. It sounds like, "Can we talk? Can you help? We're family." The words are soft. The timing is loud. When I was younger, I would have taken any apology. I would have grabbed it like a life raft because I wanted to believe my parents could see me again. But after years of being alone, I had a different question. What changed? Not in me. In them. What did they lose before they reached for me? It wasn't just money, it was influence. It was the way people stopped leaning in when my mother spoke. It was the way my father's phone stopped ringing with invitations and started ringing with reminders. It was the way their names stopped opening doors. And I know how cold that sounds, but if you've ever been on the other side of image-based love, you understand. Some people don't return because they miss you. They return because they miss what your absence is costing them. I didn't need a therapist to see that pattern. I saw it in every interaction. My mother used to be the person who organized events. Then she started showing up to them instead, sitting in the back. My father used to be the one who gave advice. Then he started asking questions. Simple ones. How are you? Can we meet? Please. Please. That word landed differently than any "I'm proud of you" ever had. Because it wasn't about me. It was about them needing something. I didn't answer right away. I let the messages sit, not to punish them, to listen to the silence between the lines. Because this is the part nobody teaches you. When someone who hurt you comes back, your body wants to make it simple. Either slam the door forever or forgive immediately. But real life doesn't feel like a clean decision. It feels like standing in the doorway with your hand on the lock, asking yourself what you're actually being asked to give: forgiveness or access. A lot of people confuse those two. They think if you forgive, you owe someone closeness again. They think if you help, you have to return to the role you escaped. That's why I started measuring apologies differently. Not by emotion, by accountability. A real apology doesn't rush you. A real apology doesn't bargain. A real apology doesn't demand you make them feel better about what they did. It doesn't say, "We did our best." It says, "We failed you." And what I was getting wasn't that, not yet. What I was getting were updates, soft pressure, people reminding me that they're getting older, and family is family, which was just the town's way of asking me to fix a discomfort I didn't create. If you were me, what would you do? Would you open the door because they finally knocked? Or would you ask why they didn't knock until the house started falling apart behind them? I kept my notebook close during that time. I saved the voicemails. I wrote down the dates. Because I didn't want to react from guilt. I wanted to respond from clarity. And clarity requires one brutal question. Before they asked for forgiveness, what did they lose? Because the answer tells you what kind of apology you're really hearing. And I was about to find out, in a way I didn't expect. The night it happened, I was washing my hands in the sink. Nothing dramatic. Just soap, water, and the same cracked mirror I'd learned not to look into for too long. My phone was on the counter, face down. It buzzed once, then again. I ignored it. I'd learned that silence was sometimes safer than hope. When I finished drying my hands, I turned the phone over. 42. That's how many voicemails were waiting. Not texts, not missed calls. Voicemails. The kind people leave when they need to be heard. I didn't open them right away. I just stared at the number, trying to remember the last time someone had left me even one message asking how I was doing. It had been years. I sat down at the small kitchen table. The chair creaked the way it always did. The fridge hummed, half empty, like it was holding its breath. I pressed play on the first voicemail. I stopped it after 3 seconds, not because it was cruel, but because it was careful. My mother's voice sounded different, slower, measured. She said my name like she was testing it, seeing if it would still respond. I didn't feel angry. I felt steady. That surprised me, so I didn't listen to the rest. I stacked the phone face down again and made myself a cup of tea I didn't really want. Because something inside me understood what this moment was. It wasn't a breakthrough. It was a reversal. For years, I had been the one reaching out into silence, explaining, waiting, hoping. Now the silence belonged to me, and I realized something important. Power doesn't announce itself. It just changes who has to wait. I carried the mug to the window and watched the streetlights flicker on, one by one. I thought about the first night I slept alone, when I checked my phone every 10 minutes just to make sure it still worked. Back then, I would have answered on the first ring. I would have taken whatever explanation they offered and folded myself around it. But that version of me had learned too much since then. She had learned that immediate response is not the same thing as compassion, that answering right away doesn't make you kind, it makes you available. And availability is something people misuse when they're scared. The next day, I listened to a few more voicemails, not all of them, just enough to hear the pattern. At first, it was confusion. We don't understand why you won't call us back. Then concern. We're worried about you. Then urgency. Please. We need to talk. By the 10th message, the tone shifted. Not to anger, to vulnerability. My father's voice cracked in a way I'd never heard before. He said he didn't know what to do. He said things were falling apart. He didn't say what things. He didn't say why. Just that they were. I paused the message there. Because that was the line. That was the difference between then and now. When I was 16, things had been falling apart for me too. I'd said it out loud. I'd asked for help. And the response had been a closed door and a sentence that sounded like freedom but felt like exile. Now they were standing on the other side of that door, and suddenly, silence felt unbearable. I asked myself a question I hadn't expected. If you were me, would you answer not out of revenge, not out of obligation, but out of truth? Because here's what no one tells you. You don't owe your immediate reaction to anyone who denied you theirs. Time isn't a punishment, it's information. So I waited. I went to work. I ate. I slept. The phone stayed on the counter. 42 became 43, then 44. I noticed how calm my body felt. No shaking hands, no racing thoughts, just space. That was when it hit me. This wasn't about ignoring them. It was about realizing I finally had a choice. For years, my life had been shaped by other people's urgency, their timelines, their comfort. Now, for the first time, the pace belonged to me. I listened to the last voicemail 3 days later. My mother cried, not loudly, not theatrically, quiet tears, the kind meant to sound sincere. She said, "We're sorry." She didn't say what for. She said, "We just want things to go back to normal." Normal. That word landed heavier than anything else, because normal had been a house where love depended on obedience. Normal had been silence as discipline. Normal had been me disappearing so their lives could stay neat. I set the phone down. I didn't feel victorious. I felt clear. Clarity is a strange thing. It doesn't rush you toward action. It asks you to sit with what's true. And what was true was this. Their need had finally caught up to my absence. The power shift wasn't loud. It wasn't cruel. It was simply the moment when I realized I no longer had to explain myself to be real. Not answering wasn't rejection. It was recognition. Recognition that my silence no longer meant I had nothing to say. It meant I was deciding if I wanted to say it at all. That's the kind of power no one can take back once you've felt it. And the voicemails stayed unheard a little longer. Not because I was afraid, but because for the first time in my life, waiting didn't feel like abandonment. It felt like choice, and that changed everything. For a long time, I thought forgiveness was supposed to look impressive, like something you did publicly, something that made other people comfortable. You answer the call, you say it's okay, you move on. That's what I was taught. So when the messages kept coming, a part of me wondered if staying silent made me cruel. If you were me, you might have felt that pressure too, because forgiveness is often framed as a moral duty, not a choice. But here's what I learned the hard way. Forgiveness without boundaries doesn't heal. It transfers weight. When I was younger, every time I forgave too quickly, I ended up carrying the consequences alone. I was the one adjusting, the one explaining, the one making things easier. Nothing actually changed. The apologies came without repairs. The regret came without responsibility. So I stopped confusing kindness with access. That was the first boundary. I didn't say I would never speak to them again. I didn't say I hated them. I just didn't open the door immediately. That decision felt small, but it changed the shape of everything. Because forgiveness doesn't mean reopening yourself to harm. It means deciding what kind of contact won't erase the work you've already done to survive. I thought about the years I spent alone, learning how to function without support, how I paid for mistakes with sleep, with hunger, with silence. No one offered forgiveness to that version of me. No one asked if I was okay carrying all of it. So I asked myself a question instead. If I forgive them now, what happens next? Do I become responsible again? Do I explain myself again? Do I make space for their feelings while shrinking my own? That's when I understood something important. Forgiveness that demands self-erasure isn't virtue, it's submission. I didn't want revenge. I didn't want to punish anyone. I wanted something quieter. I wanted my life to stay intact. So I chose a third option. People don't talk about much. I chose distance with intention. I wrote down what I was willing to do and what I wasn't. Help, but not dependency. Conversation, but not control. Acknowledgement, but not rewriting the past. Those boundaries weren't cruel. They were clear, and clarity is the opposite of chaos. When I finally responded, it wasn't emotional. It was precise. I didn't relive old arguments. I didn't list everything that hurt. I stated conditions. What contact would look like. What support would not mean. What accountability required. I wasn't angry when I wrote it. I was calm. That calm came from knowing I didn't owe forgiveness to anyone who hadn't earned trust. Trust is built forward, not backward. And forgiveness doesn't skip that step. Some people didn't understand my choice. They said I was being cold. They said I was holding on to the past. But the past wasn't what I was protecting. I was protecting the present. I'd spent too long rebuilding myself from fragments to risk handing the pieces back. If you were me, you might wonder where compassion fits into this. It fits right where boundaries are. Compassion without limits turns into obligation. Limits give compassion somewhere safe to exist. I didn't forgive to look good. I forgave to stay whole. That meant not rushing, not soothing guilt that wasn't mine, not absorbing consequences that didn't belong to me. Forgiveness, I learned, isn't a door you leave unlocked. It's a gate you choose when to open. And sometimes, The most ethical thing you can do is leave it closed long enough to see who respects it. I didn't lose my humanity by setting conditions. I preserved it. Because kindness that costs you your safety isn't kindness. It's self-betrayal. And I had done enough of that already. Forgiveness didn't make me superior. It made me deliberate. And that was the first time it felt like it belonged to me. There's something I need to say. Because stories like mine can be dangerous when they're told the wrong way. People hear the ending and think it's a formula. They think, leave, suffer, win, watch them crawl back. Like life is a movie and pain automatically turns into success. That isn't how it works. And if you're listening to this with your own story in your chest, I don't want you walking away with the wrong lesson. Because the truth is, I wasn't guaranteed anything. I didn't manifest my way out of that town. I worked. I scraped. I got lucky in small ways that added up. And there were plenty of nights I didn't feel like a survivor. I felt like a person who was tired. There's a version of this story people like to believe, the version where the right choice is always rewarded, where leaving the people who hurt you leads to a clean life, a bright future, a perfect comeback. That version makes people feel safe, because it suggests the world is fair, but the world isn't fair. Sometimes you do the brave thing and you still struggle. Sometimes you choose yourself and you still lose relationships, opportunities, stability. Sometimes you walk away and it doesn't get better for a long time. So the question matters. What if you don't become successful? What if you don't get the big turnaround? What if you don't end up with a platform, or a community center, or a mentor like Daniel? What if you just live? What if the most you get is peace? Is the choice still worth it? I think it is. Because success didn't give me my value. Success just made it harder for other people to deny it. That's an important difference. When I was 16, I didn't have achievements to prove I mattered. I didn't have awards. I didn't have a room full of people clapping. All I had was a quiet certainty that my life was mine, and even that certainty shook sometimes. If you've ever tried to build a life from scratch, you know what I mean. There are days you don't feel empowered. You feel broke. You feel stupid for trying. You feel jealous of people who have parents they can call. You feel angry at yourself for missing the same people who hurt you. None of that makes you weak. It makes you human. The reason I'm saying this is because too many people get trapped in a cruel comparison. They look at stories like mine and think, if I don't end up thriving, then maybe I should just go back. Like the only proof you made the right choice is a visible win. But the right choice isn't always the one that looks impressive. Sometimes the right choice is the one that keeps you from disappearing. Sometimes the win is that your voice stays yours, that you don't have to beg to be treated like a person, that you don't hand over your future just to avoid conflict. That's what I mean when I say success is not a moral scoreboard. It doesn't prove who was right. It just exposes who was willing to pretend you had no worth until you became useful. And that's why I don't romanticize my outcome. I'm grateful for what I built, but I don't pretend it was destiny. I had moments where I almost went back, not because I believed them, because I needed somewhere soft to land. I remember standing in a pharmacy aisle, looking at cold medicine I couldn't afford, and thinking, maybe I should just call. Not because I wanted reconciliation, because I wanted relief. That's when I realized something else. People who push you out often count on that moment. They count on you coming back when you're tired. They count on you returning not because you've forgiven, but because you've run out of options. So if you're in that place right now, I want you to hear this clearly. Your worth is not measured by your outcome. You don't have to become extraordinary to deserve basic respect. You don't have to win to prove you were hurt. You don't have to succeed to justify your boundaries. Boundaries don't require a resume. They require a truth. And if the truth is that someone's love comes with conditions that erase you, then choosing yourself is not arrogance, it's survival. Even if the world doesn't clap for it, even if you stay quiet, even if you never get a neat comeback scene, that's why I kept my notebook. That's why I save the evidence. Because when you don't have success, you need something else to hold on to. You need your reality to stay solid. You need consequences to be based on what happened, not on how impressive your life looks afterward. And maybe that's the real twist no one expects. The most powerful thing I did wasn't building a successful life. It was refusing to sign my life away just to be considered loved. If you were me, would you still choose yourself even without a trophy at the end? Because that's the question that tells you what your freedom is actually worth. And it's a question most people avoid until it's too late. People expected this story to end with a winner and a loser. They wanted a clean scoreboard. My parents lose. I win. And I understand why. It feels satisfying when a painful story has a tidy moral. It makes people believe consequences always arrive on time. But that wasn't the truth. The truth was quieter. The truth was that I didn't need them to lose for me to finally have my life back. Because the real battle wasn't about revenge. It was about reality. For years, my parents didn't just push me away. They controlled the meaning of what happened. They were the adults. They had the reputation. They had the community. So their version became the version. That's how power works when you're young. People don't ask you what happened. They ask the person who sounds most respectable. And once that story is written, it becomes hard to erase, unless you keep a record. That's why the notebook mattered. Not because it made me strong, because it made the truth stable. A stable truth doesn't have to argue. It doesn't have to shout. It doesn't have to convince everyone. It just has to exist long enough that the lies get tired. That's what happened. Not in one big confrontation, but in a slow collapse of the narrative. Someone would repeat a rumor and realize it didn't match what they'd seen. Someone would ask a question my parents couldn't answer without changing their story. A timeline that used to sound clean started sounding messy. And people notice mess, especially when you've built your whole identity on looking controlled. The most powerful thing evidence does is it changes the question. Without evidence, people ask, "Why are you upset?" With evidence, they ask, "What did you do?" That shift is everything. Because upset puts the spotlight on your emotions. But what did you do puts the spotlight on their actions. Actions create consequences. And consequences don't require you to be dramatic. They only require the truth to be undeniable. That's why I didn't have to ruin my parents. Their choices did that. Not because the universe was keeping score, because reality eventually collects its debts. If you tell a story long enough that isn't true, you have to keep feeding it. You have to keep controlling people's perception. You have to keep managing the microphone. But once the microphone slips, the truth doesn't need a stage. It just needs a crack, and cracks grow. I used to think my biggest victory would be hearing them admit everything. A perfect apology, a full confession. But life isn't a courtroom. Most people don't say, "I was wrong," in the way you deserve. Sometimes they soften it. Sometimes they minimize it. Sometimes they cry and call it regret. And if you wait for the perfect words, you can get stuck forever. So I stopped aiming for a confession. I aimed for clarity. Clarity meant I didn't need them to agree with my memories for my memories to be real. Clarity meant I didn't need the town's approval to know what happened. Clarity meant I could protect myself without needing permission. That's what people miss when they say, "Your parents lost. They didn't lose because I beat them. They lost because the truth outlasted their control. And the truth wasn't even loud. It was in dates, in saved messages, in a pattern of behavior that kept showing up even when they tried to hide it. It was in the fact that their apologies arrived only after their influence weakened. It was in the way their concern sounded like urgency. It was in the way they wanted normal back, but never addressed what normal had cost me. Evidence doesn't punish people. Evidence removes their ability to pretend. That's the difference. And that's why the ending wasn't about them falling. It was about me no longer being movable. Once you have your own record of reality, you stop being easy to gaslight. You stop being easy to pressure. You stop being easy to guilt into silence. The moral authority shifts, not because you become older, because you become honest. Not just honest in your feelings, honest in your facts. And that's a kind of honesty that changes outcomes, because it forces responsibility into the room, whether people want it there or not. If you were me, you might still want closure. You might still want to hear the words, "I'm sorry," said the right way. I did too. But the truth is, closure isn't always a sentence someone gives you. Sometimes closure is the moment you stop bargaining with reality. Sometimes it's the moment you realize the truth doesn't need to be defended forever. It only needs to be remembered accurately. That's why I kept writing. That's why I kept saving. Not so I could destroy anyone. So no one could destroy what happened. Because when the truth is recorded, it becomes heavier than reputation. And once it's heavy enough, the microphone doesn't matter as much anymore. The question stops being, who do we believe, and becomes, what are we willing to do with what's real? And that's where power actually lives. Not in age, not in status, not in how convincing someone sounds. Power lives in the person who refuses to let the truth disappear. And once you become that person, you don't need revenge to feel whole. You just need reality to stay standing. I never told you what I did after the voicemails. Not every detail. Because the truth is, there isn't one ending that fits everyone. People keep asking, did you let them back in? Like there are only two doors, locked forever, or wide open. But real life doesn't work like that. Real life is a gate. You decide when it opens, how far, and who stands on which side. I didn't wake up one morning and suddenly feel healed. I just got tired of living inside other people's expectations. The town expected me to be the bigger person. My parents expected me to make things normal again. Even strangers expected a moral lesson they could feel good about. And all of that pressure had one message underneath it: make us comfortable. But I wasn't comfortable for years, and no one rushed to fix that. So I took my time. I listened again to a few of the voicemails, just to be sure my memory wasn't rewriting itself. I opened my notebook and reread the dates, the quotes, the small moments I'd recorded when no one was watching. I wasn't trying to stay angry. I was trying to stay accurate. Because accuracy is what keeps you from going back into the same trap with different words. Eventually, I responded, not with an emotional phone call, with a message that was simple. I said I'd talk, but not in my parents' house, not on their schedule, not in front of the town. I said I would not discuss my attitude. I would discuss what happened. I said if we met, the goal wasn't to erase the past. The goal was to acknowledge it. That was my gate. And you know what's strange? Setting that boundary didn't feel dramatic. It felt quiet. Like putting both feet on the ground and realizing you don't have to lean toward anyone anymore. When the day came, I didn't drive back into town like some triumphant return. I parked at a small cafe off the highway, the kind of place where nobody cared who you were. My hands didn't shake. That was new. I saw them through the window before they saw me. They looked older than I remembered. Not just physically, Their posture was different, like they had been carrying something heavy and didn't know where to set it down. My mother reached for my hand when I sat, then pulled back like she wasn't sure she was allowed. My father kept clearing his throat like he was practicing words he didn't fully believe yet. They started with the safe sentences. "We didn't know you'd take it so hard. We thought you'd come back. We were trying to teach you. Teach you." That phrase used to make me feel small. That day it sounded like a confession, because teaching is what you do when you're in control. And this time, control wasn't sitting with them. It was sitting with me. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I asked one question. "What were you trying to teach me when you let me be alone?" They didn't answer right away. Silence filled the space between us, not the old silence that punished me, a different silence, a silence where they had to face what they'd avoided. My mother cried. My father stared at his coffee like it had a solution at the bottom, and in that moment, I realized something. This wasn't about winning. It was about whether they could finally stand in reality without trying to edit it. They said they were sorry. Still not perfectly. Still with gaps. But they said it. And I didn't feel the rush people imagine forgiveness should bring. I felt cautious. I felt tired. I felt aware. Because an apology is not a relationship. An apology is a sentence. A relationship is what happens after the sentence, over time, through behavior. So I didn't promise anything. I didn't say we were okay. I said what I was willing to do. I said I could help in ways that didn't pull me back into dependence. I could be respectful without being available. I could be kind without being controllable. And that's the part I want to leave you with. If you're watching this and your story looks different, that doesn't mean you're wrong. Maybe you never get an apology. Maybe you get one too late. Maybe the people who hurt you never lose anything at all. That happens, and it's not fair. But your life doesn't have to wait for their fairness. Your healing doesn't require their understanding. Your boundaries don't need their approval. So here's my question. If you were me, would you open the gate? Would you open it a crack? With conditions? Would you keep it closed to protect your peace? Would you open it for a conversation but not for access? And if you've never been in this situation, ask yourself something else. If someone you loved told you this story, would you pressure them to forgive, or would you protect their right to choose? Because that's what this really comes down to. Not who wins, not who loses, who gets to decide what happens next. If this hits something in you, don't keep it in your head alone. Share it with someone who needs to hear they're not cruel for having boundaries. And tell me in the comments if you were in my place. Would you open the gate or not?